Welcome to the final days of Carthage, 146 BCE, when fire, iron, and law collapsed into conquest. After 3 Punic wars, Rome did not merely defeat its rival, it erased it. Ancient sources speak of tens of thousands taken alive, among them 10,000 women, absorbed into a brutal economy of victory, where bodies became spoils and punishment became policy. Commanded by Scipio Aemilianus, Rome claimed order, yet practiced terror, enslavement, humiliation, and coerced submission, used to warn the world what resistance cost. Historians like Polybius understood this not as chaos, but as design. In this video, we step into that silence after the siege to examine how empire enforced power not only with legions, but with intimate cruelty written onto the defeated. Marcus Porcius Cato, the elder statesman whose moral severity had become legendary in Rome, never visited Carthage during the final years of his life. Yet the city consumed his thoughts with an intensity bordering on obsession. According to Plutarch, Cato ended every speech in the Roman Senate with the same phrase, regardless of the topic under discussion: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. Whether the Senate was debating taxation, public works, or grain supplies, Cato would find a way to return to his singular preoccupation. On one occasion, he reportedly shook fresh figs from his toga before his fellow senators, pointing out that these fruits had been picked in Carthage just 3 days earlier. The proximity of Rome's ancient enemy, the fertility of its lands, and the resilience of its people haunted Cato until his death in 149 BCE. He did not live to see Carthage fall, but the destruction he had advocated so relentlessly came to pass within 3 years of his final breath. The Third Punic War, which began the year Cato died, would end not merely with Roman victory, but with the complete obliteration of a civilization and the enslavement of its entire surviving population. The roots of this apocalyptic conflict stretched back more than a century to the titanic struggles of the First and Second Punic Wars. Carthage, the great Phoenician trading empire that had dominated the Western Mediterranean for centuries, had nearly destroyed Rome during the Second Punic War. When Hannibal Barca led his army across the Alps and inflicted devastating defeats on Roman forces at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE remained Rome's worst military disaster, with ancient sources claiming that between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. Though Rome ultimately prevailed, forcing Carthage to surrender its Spanish territories, its war elephants, and most of its fleet, the trauma of Hannibal's invasion never fully healed. A generation of Roman children grew up hearing stories of the Carthaginian general who had made Rome tremble. This institutional memory of existential threat shaped Roman policy toward Carthage for decades, transforming a defeated rival into an object of paranoid vigilance. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage had recovered much of its commercial prosperity, despite the restrictions imposed by the peace treaty of 201 BCE. The city's merchants continued to dominate trade routes across North Africa and beyond. Its agricultural hinterland produced abundant grain, wine, and olive oil. This recovery alarmed Roman hawks like Cato, who saw in Carthage's resilience evidence of an enduring threat. The specific casus belli that triggered the Third Punic War was almost absurdly minor. Carthage had raised an army to defend itself against incursions by Massinissa, the Roman allied king of Numidia, without first obtaining Rome's permission as required by treaty. This technical violation provided the pretext Rome's war faction had sought. In 149 BCE, Roman forces landed in North Africa with demands so extreme they seemed designed to provoke resistance. The Carthaginians were ordered to surrender 300 hostages from noble families, hand over all weapons and military equipment, and finally, abandon their city entirely and relocate at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea that had been the source of their wealth and identity. When the Carthaginians refused this last demand, Understanding that it meant the death of their civilization, even without military conquest, Rome had the war it wanted. The siege that followed lasted 3 years and culminated in one of antiquity's most thorough urban destructions. Carthage was a formidable target, protected by massive walls and a population desperate to defend their homes. The early Roman commanders achieved little, and it was only with the appointment of Scipio Aemilianus in 147 BCE that the siege gained effective leadership. Scipio, the adopted grandson of the Scipio Africanus who had defeated Hannibal, combined military competence with the political connections necessary to sustain a prolonged campaign. He systematically isolated Carthage, cutting off its harbour and starving the city into submission. By the spring of 146 BCE, Roman forces had breached the walls and begun the final assault. What followed was not merely a military operation, but a methodical extermination. Street by street, house by house, Roman soldiers fought their way through a city whose inhabitants knew that surrender meant slavery and resistance meant death. Appian's account describes 6 days of continuous combat, with soldiers fighting through narrow streets and across rooftops, setting fires to clear their path and slaughtering defenders who refused to yield. The great temple of Eshmaun, perched on the Bursa hill at Carthage's heart, became the final refuge for hundreds of Romans deserters who had joined the Carthaginian cause and knew they could expect no mercy. They set the temple ablaze rather than face capture, perishing alongside Hasdrubal's wife, who reportedly cursed her husband for his cowardice before throwing herself and her children into the flames. When the fighting finally ended, approximately 50,000 Carthaginians remained alive to surrender. These survivors represented a fraction of the city's pre-war population, which scholars estimate at somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 inhabitants. The rest had perished from combat, starvation, disease, or the fires that had consumed much of the city. Those who survived found themselves subject to the absolute power that Roman law granted victors over the vanquished. Under the legal principle of post liminium, free persons captured in war underwent a complete transformation of status. They ceased to be citizens, subjects, or even legally recognized persons. They became res things property to be disposed of at the victor's discretion. Women captured in the sack of Carthage lost not only their freedom but their very legal personhood, becoming objects whose bodies, labor, and reproductive capacity belonged entirely to whoever purchased them. Roman attitudes toward conquered populations reflected a worldview that modern sensibilities find deeply alien, though it was entirely typical of ancient Mediterranean societies. The right of victors to enslave the defeated was universally accepted. It required no justification and admitted no exceptions. Polybius, the Greek historian who accompanied Scipio during the campaign and witnessed Carthage's fall, expressed no moral qualms about mass enslavement. For him, as for his Roman patrons, the capture and sale of enemy populations was simply what happened when cities fell. Women occupied a particular place within this system of violence. They represented both valuable commodities. Young women especially could command high prices in slave markets and symbols of the conquered people's subjugation. The violation of enemy women was understood as an assertion of dominance, a demonstration that the victors possessed total power over everything the defeated had valued. This was not hidden or shameful, but openly acknowledged as one of warfare's expected outcomes. Ancient sources provide varying estimates of the numbers enslaved at Carthage, though all agree on the massive scale of the deportation. Appian mentions 50,000 captives, while other accounts suggest even higher figures. What is certain is that the enslaved population included a substantial proportion of women, likely numbering around 10,000 or more. These women came from every level of Carthaginian society. Noble ladies who had presided over wealthy households found themselves standing beside former servants in slave markets. Priestesses of Tanit, the great goddess whose cult had dominated Carthaginian religious life, were sold alongside prostitutes and laborers. The democracy of defeat erased social distinctions that had structured their entire lives. Roman military law made no provision for protecting any of them. The ius gentium, the body of law governing relations between Romans and foreign peoples, recognized the enslavement of war captives as legitimate and provided no mechanism for appeal or release. Once captured, the women of Carthage entered a legal void from which only manumission, the formal grant of freedom by an owner, could extract them. The infrastructure of Roman slavery stood ready to absorb this human flood. Slave traders, known as mangones or venellicii, followed Roman armies precisely to purchase captives fresh from conquest. These merchants had developed sophisticated networks for transporting, housing, and marketing enslaved persons across the Mediterranean world. Major slave markets existed at Delos, Ephesus, Side, and numerous Italian cities. Captives from Carthage would have entered this system within days of the city's fall, processed with an efficiency that reflected centuries of commercial refinement. Buyers assessed potential purchases with the calculating eye of livestock traders, examining teeth, limbs, and general health. Young women faced additional inspections that ancient sources describe with disturbing frankness. Prices varied enormously depending on age, appearance, skills, and perceived tractability. A beautiful young woman might sell for thousands of denarii. An older widow, with no particular skills, might fetch barely enough to cover the cost of her transport. Either way, the transaction transformed a Carthaginian woman into Roman property, a status from which only death or an owner's generosity could release her. When the Roman legions finally breached Carthage's walls in the spring of 146 BCE, the military phase of conquest gave way to something far more intimate and enduring. The swords that had cut through Carthaginian defenders would soon be sheathed, but the violence visited upon the city's women was only beginning. For the estimated 10,000 women who survived the siege and surrendered to Roman forces, capture marked not an end to warfare, but its continuation through different means. Their bodies became territories to be claimed, their autonomy a prize to be extinguished, their identities markers to be erased. This was not incidental to Roman victory, it was constitutive of it. The subjugation of Carthage's women demonstrated, in the most visceral terms possible, that Rome's dominance was total and that nothing belonging to the conquered remained beyond the victor's reach. Coercive treatment in ancient warfare operated according to a logic that historians have only recently begun to examine with appropriate rigor. Modern scholarship, influenced by feminist analysis and comparative studies of conflict, understands wartime abuse of women, not primarily as an expression of individual desire, but as a deliberate instrument of collective domination. When soldiers assaulted conquered women, they were enacting a symbolic drama in which the defeated community's inability to protect its most vulnerable members demonstrated the completeness of its subjugation. The Roman legal concept of stuprum applied only to free Roman women. Foreign captives existed outside this protective framework entirely. A Carthaginian woman's body belonged to whoever had captured her, and what he chose to do with that body was a matter of property rights rather than personal violation. This legal framework did not merely allow coercive acts against women, it structured expectations around conquest in ways that made such violence routine and unremarkable. The immediate aftermath of Carthage's fall would have seen widespread assault during what soldiers euphemistically termed the sack, the period of uncontrolled violence that customarily followed a successful siege. Roman commanders generally permitted their troops a period of looting and assault as both reward for their service and punishment for the enemy's resistance. Scipio Aemilianus, despite his reputation for personal discipline and philosophical inclination, did not deviate from this practice. The 6 days of street fighting that Appian describes would have created countless opportunities for violence against women who emerged from hiding or were discovered in the ruins. Ancient sources do not dwell on these details, not because they did not occur, but because they were too commonplace to merit comment. The silence of historians like Polybius and Appian on the mistreatment of women speaks volumes about their assumptions. They were not concealing atrocities from sensitive readers. They were simply declining to document what everyone understood as the normal and expected outcome of military conquest. Once the chaos of the sack subsided, surviving women entered the more orderly but equally brutal system of Roman slavery. Their initial disposition would have been determined by Roman officers, who customarily claimed the most valuable captives for themselves before releasing the remainder to slave traders. A woman selected by a Roman commander might become his concubine for the duration of the campaign, traveling with his retinue until he returned to Italy and decided whether to keep her, sell her, or dispose of her in some other fashion. The legal term for such arrangements was concubinatus, a recognized form of personal relationship between a free man and a woman of lower or enslaved status. Unlike marriage, concubinage created no legal obligations to the woman involved and gave her no claim to support, fidelity, or continued relationship. A concubine could be sold, given away, or abandoned at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. Children born from such unions inherited their mother's enslaved status and could be sold separately from her at the owner's discretion. Those women not claimed by officers entered the commercial slave trade, where their fates depended largely on the calculations of merchants seeking to maximize profit. Young women deemed attractive by Roman standards faced the particular horror of sale into prostitution. Roman brothels, known as lupanaria, operated openly in most cities and towns, staffed primarily by enslaved women who had no power to refuse customers or negotiate the conditions of their labor. The prostituted woman represented perhaps the starkest example of bodily commodification in the Roman world. Her physical person had been converted entirely into a source of revenue for her owner, with no aspect of her existence remaining under her own control. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and other sites reveals the grim conditions of these establishments: small cells, barely large enough for a bed, explicit imagery, advertising services, and names scratched into walls that provide our only record of women who otherwise vanished from history. Some of the women who serviced customers in Roman brothels during the late 2nd century BCE would have been Carthaginian captives, their backgrounds erased by a commercial system that cared nothing for their origins. The reproductive exploitation of enslaved women constituted another dimension of Roman slave ownership that scholars have increasingly recognized as systematic rather than incidental. Enslaved women's fertility belonged to their owners, who could breed them deliberately to produce additional slaves. The agronomist Columella, writing somewhat later than the fall of Carthage but describing practices that were well established by then, recommended that female slaves who produced multiple children should be rewarded with reduced workloads or even eventual freedom incentives designed to encourage reproduction. Varro, another Roman writer on agricultural management, infamously classified slaves as speaking tools and discussed their breeding in the same practical terms he applied to livestock. This reduction of human beings to instruments of production was not metaphorical but literal. The children of enslaved women were assets to be calculated in estate inventories, alongside cattle, equipment, and grain stores. For Carthaginian women who survived the siege, this meant that even the most intimate aspects of their biological existence, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and maternal attachment had been expropriated by their owners. Public humiliation and bodily control served as ongoing instruments of psychological domination that extended far beyond direct personal or physical abuse. Roman slavery was designed to produce what the sociologist Orlando Patterson has termed social death, the complete alienation of the enslaved person from all claims to honor, family, community, and autonomous identity. Enslaved persons could be beaten, branded, shackled, or subjected to virtually any physical treatment their owners deemed appropriate. They could be forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain connections with family members. They could be renamed at will, stripped of the identities they had carried since birth and assigned new designations that emphasized their status as property. A Carthaginian woman named for the goddess Tanit might find herself called Syra, or Prima, or simply Girl, her original name forgotten, along with everything else that had once made her a person rather than a possession. The legal framework of Roman slavery offered enslaved women essentially no protection against abuse. Roman law did eventually develop some minimal constraints on the treatment of slaves, but these emerged gradually and applied primarily in extreme cases. During the period immediately following Carthage's fall, an owner's power over his slaves was nearly absolute. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, could still assert that owners possessed the power of life and death over their slaves, though by his time, certain restrictions had been introduced. In 146 BCE, no such restrictions existed. An enslaved Carthaginian woman who was beaten, raped, tortured, or killed by her owner had no legal recourse whatsoever. She could not testify in court, could not bring charges, could not even serve as a witness in cases involving free persons, except under torture. The Roman legal system not only failed to protect enslaved women, it actively constructed them as beings for whom concepts like assault, injury, and violation had no legal meaning. Ancient historians who documented the fall of Carthage showed no inclination to examine these realities. Appian, our most detailed source for the Third Punic War, mentions the enslavement of 50,000 Carthaginians, almost parenthetically, as a routine consequence of military defeat, requiring no particular comment. Polybius, who actually witnessed the city's destruction, was more interested in analyzing Scipio's tactical decisions and drawing lessons for future commanders than in recording what happened to the civilian population. This silence should not be mistaken for ignorance or discretion. Greek and Roman historians operated within conventions that privileged military and political narratives while treating enslaved persons as background figures unworthy of sustained attention. The suffering of Carthaginian women was not concealed because it was shameful. It was simply not considered historically significant. What mattered was the victory, the strategy that produced it, and the territorial and economic gains that followed. The human cost of these achievements, borne disproportionately by women, children, and the enslaved, rarely entered the historical record except as statistics measuring the magnitude of Roman success. Modern readers often struggle to reconcile the intellectual and artistic achievements of Greco-Roman civilization with the brutality of its slave system. This discomfort reflects our own assumptions about the relationship between culture and morality, assumptions that ancient writers did not share. Polybius, who composed sophisticated analyses of political constitutions and the rise of Roman power, saw no contradiction between his philosophical interests and his acceptance of mass enslavement. Scipio Aemilianus, who reputedly wept while watching Carthage burn and quoted Homer on the mutability of fortune, presided over the capture and sale of 50,000 human beings without apparent qualms. The enslaved women of Carthage entered a world that combined extraordinary cultural sophistication with institutional cruelty so profound that their very existence as persons requiring moral consideration went unrecognized. They became instruments of Roman power, their bodies testifying to the completeness of Carthage's defeat in ways that no monument or triumph could match. When the fires of Carthage finally died in the spring of 146 BCE, the city that had rivaled Rome for Mediterranean supremacy lay in ruins. Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general who had orchestrated its destruction, reportedly wept as he watched the flames consume 6 centuries of Punic civilization. According to Polybius, who stood beside him, Scipio murmured lines from Homer about the fall of Troy, contemplating whether Rome itself might one day meet a similar fate. It was a rare moment of reflection amid an act of calculated annihilation. But whatever private doubts Scipio harbored, they did not extend to mercy for the survivors. Approximately 50,000 Carthaginians, men, women, and children, emerged from the smoking rubble to surrender. Within days, they had vanished into the machinery of Roman slavery, scattered across an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. For the estimated 10,000 women among them, this dispersal marked the beginning of a second destruction, not of their city, but of their identities, their families, and ultimately their place in historical memory. The Roman slave trade operated with brutal efficiency, and the fall of Carthage provided it with an enormous windfall. Captives from the siege would have been processed rapidly, likely at temporary markets established near the ruins or at major trading centers like Delos, which by the mid-2nd century BCE had become the Mediterranean's largest slave emporium. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing somewhat later, claimed that Delos could process 10,000 slaves in a single day, a figure that may be exaggerated but nonetheless captures the industrial scale of the enterprise. Carthaginian women, depending on their age, appearance, and perceived skills, would have been sorted and sold to buyers from across the Roman world. Some might have remained in North Africa, purchased by Roman colonists who would soon establish settlements on the very land where Carthage had stood. Others would have been transported to Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, or the Iberian Peninsula. A woman who had lived her entire life within Carthage's walls might find herself, within weeks of the city's fall, laboring in a Roman household in Campania or serving in a workshop in Corinth. The journey itself was often deadly. Ancient sources occasionally mention slaves dying in transit from illness, exposure, or despair, though such deaths were treated as commercial losses rather than human tragedies. This physical dispersal accomplished something that military conquest alone could not: the complete dissolution of Carthaginian communal identity. A people exists not only in its monuments and institutions, but in the daily interactions of families, neighbors, and fellow citizens. When Rome scattered Carthage's survivors across thousands of miles, it severed every connection that had made them a people. Mothers were separated from daughters. Sisters were sold to different buyers. Women who had shared neighborhoods, temples, and marketplaces would never see each other again. The Punic language, which had been spoken across the Western Mediterranean for centuries, survived only in isolated pockets and eventually faded into silence. The goddess Tanit, whose symbol had adorned Carthaginian ships and homes, found no temples in Rome. Religious practices, naming traditions, and cultural knowledge that had passed from mother to daughter for generations ended abruptly when those chains of transmission were broken. Within a single generation, Carthaginian identity had been functionally extinguished, not through genocide in the modern sense, but through a systematic disaggregation that was, in its own way, equally final. The children born to enslaved Carthaginian women inherited their mother's legal status but little else. Under Roman law, the child of an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's status. These children would have been raised speaking Latin or Greek, worshipping Roman gods, and bearing names chosen by their owners. They would have known nothing of Carthage except perhaps fragmentary stories whispered by mothers who themselves grew hazier on the details with each passing year. By the time Augustus established the Roman colony of Colonia Julia Concordia Carthago on the site of the old city in 29 BCE, almost nothing remained of the Punic population that had once lived there. The new Carthage was a Roman city, populated by Roman settlers, built according to Roman urban planning. If any descendants of the original inhabitants still lived as slaves in the region, they had long since ceased to identify as Carthaginian. Ancient historians who recorded these events showed remarkably little interest in the experiences of enslaved women. Appian, whose account of the Punic Wars is our most detailed source for the siege of Carthage, mentions the mass enslavement, almost in passing, as a natural and unremarkable consequence of military defeat. Polybius, who actually witnessed the fall of the city, was more concerned with strategic analysis and the lessons Roman commanders might draw from the campaign than with the fate of non-combatants. This silence was not accidental. Greek and Roman historical writing operated within conventions that privileged military and political narratives centered on elite male actors. Enslaved women existed at the intersection of several categories: female, foreign, unfree, that rendered them marginal to the concerns of ancient historiography. When they appeared in texts at all, it was usually as statistics demonstrating the scale of a victory, as property in legal documents, or as minor characters in anecdotes designed to illustrate some other point. Their inner lives, their suffering, and their strategies for survival went unrecorded. This documentary silence has shaped modern understanding in ways that historians are only beginning to address. For centuries, scholars studying the Punic Wars focused almost exclusively on military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, and the famous rivalry between Rome and Hannibal. The human cost of these conflicts, particularly the cost borne by women and children, received little attention. When enslavement was discussed, it was often in economic terms, as a source of labor that fueled Roman agricultural and industrial expansion. The violence inherent in the system, and especially the forced exploitation that was common within ancient slavery, was treated as background noise, too ubiquitous to merit special comment. Only in recent decades have scholars like Sandra Joschel, Sheila Murnaghan, and Kyle Harper begun to reconstruct the experiences of enslaved women in antiquity, drawing on scattered textual references, archaeological evidence, and comparative analysis to illuminate lives that ancient sources deliberately obscured. The fate of Carthage's women was not exceptional. Rome repeated this pattern of mass enslavement and cultural destruction throughout its centuries of expansion. When Lucius Mummius sacked Corinth, in the same year that Carthage fell, 146 BCE, he enslaved its population and shipped Greece's artistic treasures to Rome. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE, he reportedly enslaved over 1 million people, flooding Italian markets with Celtic captives. When Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, Jewish prisoners were distributed across the empire's gladiatorial schools and mines. In each case, the pattern was similar. Military victory followed by mass enslavement, family separation, geographic dispersal, and eventual cultural absorption. The women of Carthage were neither the first nor the last to experience this process, but their fate illustrates with particular clarity how Roman imperialism operated not merely through military dominance, but through the systematic destruction of conquered people's ability to reproduce themselves as communities. The archaeological record offers occasional glimpses of these vanished lives. Tombstones from across the Roman world sometimes preserve Punic names, suggesting that some Carthaginian slaves or their descendants retained at least this fragment of their heritage. A handful of religious artifacts indicate that worship of Tanit and Baal Hammon persisted in scattered locations for generations after Carthage's fall. But these traces are fragments, isolated survivals that only underscore the magnitude of what was lost. The women who emerged from Carthage's ruins in 146 BCE carried within them an entire civilization's worth of knowledge, memory, and tradition. Within decades, almost all of it had been erased not by fire or sword, but by the simple, relentless mechanisms of a slave system designed to transform human beings into fungible commodities. Their silence echoes through the historical record, a void that speaks more eloquently than any ancient text to the true cost of Roman victory. And so we leave Carthage, 146 BCE, its walls broken, its people counted, its women reduced to trophies of victory, as Rome wrote conquest onto their bodies as well as its history. Chains replaced citizenship, silence replaced names, and punishment became spectacle in the aftershock of annihilation. The Romans had a phrase for moments like this: "Vae victis, woe to the conquered." Thank you for watching, and goodbye, from the ruins where empire revealed its most intimate cruelty.